So what needs to happen is the United States needs to wake up to reality. Our neoconservatives, starting with Bush Sr., then Clinton, then Bush Jr., then Obama, then Trump, then Biden, all of them have continued on this deep state path of expanding the U.S. military to Ukraine. This is what needs to end. Then the war will end immediately.
This is Professor Jeffrey Sachs, an American economist who has emerged as one of the most rational voices in the United States on global affairs. Professor Sachs isn't afraid to speak the truth about the U.S. government's involvement in numerous conflicts around the world. And in today's video, I sit down with the professor to talk about the future of the Ukraine war. For the better part of 3 years, Western media has misled the public on the Ukraine war. Take, for example, this February 2024 article from the National Interest, which reports that Putin has big plans to recreate the Russian Empire. The media wants you to believe that Putin is on a quest to revive the former Soviet Union, and after he conquers Ukraine, he will threaten Western Europe with war. It's a bold claim, but there is no actual evidence to support it, and simple logic will tell you that Russia doesn't even have the military capacity to achieve such a goal. Professor Sachs cuts through the noise and tells us exactly who is fighting this war with Russia.
First, it's a Russia-U.S. conflict. Ukraine is the place where the fighting is taking place. It's where people are dying. But this is a conflict between the United States and Russia.
In today's interview, Professor Sachs will reveal the complex history of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, what is happening with North Korean troops fighting in Ukraine, and how U.S. citizens changed the future of this war with the re-election of Donald Trump as president. If you want to understand the truth about Ukraine and where this conflict is going in 2025, this is the video for you. Let's begin. A lot of people think that this war started in 2022. I think we all know that it actually started much earlier than that. What's the biggest misconceptions about the Russia-Ukraine conflict that most people don't understand?
First, it's a Russia-U.S. conflict. Ukraine is the place where the fighting is taking place. It's where people are dying. But this is a conflict between the United States and Russia. This war arose because the United States decided back in the 1990s, after the end of the Soviet Union, that now the U.S. could spread its military power and its geopolitical power more generally to the east, to surround Russia, perhaps even to break up Russia. What we are observing is part of a long-term U.S. strategy aiming at global dominance. Back in 1990, when the Soviet Union was still there and President Mikhail Gorbachev was leading the Soviet Union and making peace and ending the Cold War, he was required to approve the reunification of Germany because the Soviet Union was one of the 4 occupying powers, and it had legal authority to approve or to block German reunification. As that was being discussed in early 1990, the United States and Germany said absolutely, as clearly as can be, the US and Germany would never take advantage of the Soviet Union through unification, and that in fact, as Secretary of State James Baker said on February 9th, 1990 to Gorbachev, NATO, that is the US military alliance, will not move 1 inch eastward in the event that the Soviet Union approves German reunification. Gorbachev said that's very important. Right. And that pledge was reiterated by Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the German foreign minister, and repeatedly by NATO and by US and European leaders. Of course, the US then cheated. The Soviet Union ended in December 1991. Russia is legally the continuation state and the successor state. That means the treaties, the agreements apply. The United States, under Bill Clinton in 1994, based on plans already concocted by Cheney and Wolfowitz in the final year of the Bush administration, began NATO enlargement eastward. And the idea was to weaken Russia, to close Russia's access to the Eastern Mediterranean, to surround Russia in the Black Sea region so that Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia would all be NATO countries, thereby surrounding Russia, where its naval fleet has been since 1783 in Crimea, in Sevastopol. This was the plan. The Russians were absolutely opposed and aghast, and this plan went forward for 30 years. The U.S. government has lied. It has cheated. It has overthrown a government in Ukraine in February 2022, 2014, the Yanukovych government.
Right.
It was part of a very typical U.S. regime change operation. Yanukovych's fault from the U.S. point of view is that he favored neutrality, not NATO membership. He was standing in the way of this U.S. power grab. All of this, by the way, was described in 1997 by Zbigniew Brzezinski in a couple of places, one in an article in Foreign Affairs magazine, and second in his book called The Grand Chessboard.
Right.
And in the Grand Chessboard, Brzezinski says, we can do it. Russia will have no alternative but to fall in line. That was their gambit.
Wow.
And of course, it was completely wrong. Ukraine, not Ukraine, the side that was part of the coup basically became both a U.S. vassal and a radical regime, saying, okay, we have the United States military on our side.
Right.
Will defeat Russia. This was reckless and foolhardy. Now Zelensky, of course, could not win an actual vote. He rules by decree as an unelected official because his term ended a long time ago. So all of this is a tragedy, but it's a U.S. provoked tragedy.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that history and your extensive knowledge on this. I want to talk a little bit as of right now. We're in November 2024. We now have North Korean troops that have been deployed, and it just seems like this conflict is growing. What is really your predictions for the next few months as we, continue to see this conflict unfold? How do you see the future going?
On the ground in the war, Russia is winning. It is taking territory every day. Around 2,000 Ukrainians are dying or severely wounded every day. Ukraine has been worn down. Russia is accelerating its advance. So this is the reality. Not at all surprising, denied even until today by the Western mainstream media and the U.S. propaganda coming out of the White House or the State Department. But this is the ground reality.
Right.
So the hardliners say, well, we should now attack Russia inside Russian territory, in fact, far inside Russian territory, with missiles that would require U.S. programming and the U.S. support to target and to launch. The Russians have said, if you do that, we are at direct war with the United States, and we will retaliate as we see fit. The British, who are perhaps the most irresponsible government in the world, actually, this saying a lot. They talk big as if they're the big British Empire, but basically they're trying to get the U.S. into World War III. Their prime minister came over to Washington and said, yeah, we should attack Russia. That means you, the United States.
Right.
This time the Pentagon said no. I hope it continues to say no, because that could escalate to nuclear war if we started that. And we need to be absolutely aware of that. What should be done is what should have been done 30 years ago, what should have been done a decade ago, what should have been done in 2021, what should have been done in 2022. And that is to say, this whole NATO enlargement business, this is a provocation. It's dangerous. It puts the United States right up against Russia. It is viewed by Russia as a fundamental threat to national security, just as the United States would view it if Russia tried to set up a military base and missile systems on the Rio Grande in Mexico, for example. This would not go down well. The United States would say, oh, that's no problem at all. We nearly went to nuclear war over exactly that issue in Cuba in 1962. So what needs to happen is the United States needs to wake up to reality. Our neoconservatives, starting with Bush Sr., then Clinton, then Bush Jr., then Obama, then Trump, then Biden, all of them have continued on this deep state path of expanding the U.S. military to Ukraine. This is what needs to end. Then the war will end immediately. Set the new borders, exactly what's going to happen. Okay, that is going to take a little bit of time, but this is a war about Russia's understandable perception about its fundamental national security because of the U.S. push for NATO enlargement and for missile systems and weapon systems going to the east to surround Russia. That's what this war is about. That's how this war needs to end.
Do you think the U.S. government will be able to swallow their pride and admit that they've made a mistake and actually make this pivot? Or are we just going to continue to see them preach this message that, we stand with Ukraine because it's democracy, Russia's the bad guys, we're going to keep fighting, and these neocons are going to keep pushing us?
On this particular issue, Trump and Vance say, yes, they will stop the war, basically because they see that this is a mess that the U.S. got into. Vance has been especially clear on all of this point. On other wars, a little bit different, but on this issue, Trump and Vance say this. At the same time, Harris says the opposite. She's filled with bravado and I think utterly misguided policy of the last 5 presidents, including her own administration. All the rhetoric, we need to stand tall, we need to defeat Putin, we need to do this, we need to do that, all of which is failing, but as it fails, pushes us also closer to nuclear war.